in the heart of Mississippi in 1849, where cotton stalks reached higher than the dreams of free men and the Mississippi River carried more sorrow than water, there exists a tale the official records never dared to inscribe. The Riverside Mansion, with its white pillars and perfumed gardens, was the setting for what the newspapers of the day termed an inexplicable family tragedy. A wedding feast that became a collective funeral. In one January night, 17 members of Warren County's most prominent families fell to a slow and agonizing death, their faces frozen in expressions physicians could never explain. What they did not realize was that the answer rested in the calloused hands of a woman who had lost everything, yet discovered something far more potent: the patience to serve justice on the finest platter society had ever known. This is the story of Celia, a cook who turned spices into vengeance and recipes into death warrants, a woman who selected her own surname when she decided she would no longer be anyone's property. Before we go on, tell us where you're listening from, and if this is your first time with us on this channel, and remember to subscribe for more tales that the official record chose to forget. The Riverside Plantation sprawled across more than 2,000 acres along the muddy banks of the Mississippi. Its endless rows of cotton swayed like a pale sea under the scorching summer sun of 1848. It was one of Warren County's most prosperous estates, known not just for the quality of its harvest, but for the grandeur of its main house and, most of all, for the excellence of its table. Colonel James Riverside had inherited the land from his father and expanded it with the same calculated brutality that defined men of his standing. Tall, thin as a switch, and with eyes the color of winter ice, he commanded his 340 slaves with an iron fist inside a velvet glove. He firmly believed that harsh discipline, softened with minor concessions, preserved order more effectively than pure violence. The crown jewel of his property was not the cotton, but the culinary reputation that drew visitors from neighboring plantations. Politicians from Jackson, merchants who plied the Mississippi, and planters from nearby counties made certain to accept any invitation to a riverside dinner. The secret of this fame lay in the hands of a woman few guests ever saw, but whose talent every one of them tasted. Celia had come to the plantation as a child in 1829, part of a lot of slaves bought from a bankrupt estate in South Carolina. She was just 8 years old then, with wide, curious eyes and an extraordinary memory for flavors and aromas. The head cook at the time, an elderly woman called Mama Ruth, soon noticed the girl's natural gift and took her under her wing. For 16 years, Celia learned not only how to cook, but to understand the secrets of spices, the science behind fermentation, the mysteries of herbs that grew wild in the nearby swamps. Mama Ruth, born in Africa and brought to America as a young woman, carried ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants and their properties. She taught Celia that every leaf, every root, every seed had a purpose. Some to heal, others to bring sleep, and some had uses better not spoken of aloud. Mama Ruth would say, as they dried herbs beneath the moonlight, that her people had known the earth's secrets since before the ships, since before the chains. This knowledge lived in the blood, passed from mother to daughter, like an inheritance that could never be stolen. Mama Ruth also taught Celia something just as valuable: how to read and write. During the long winter nights when kitchen work slowed, she showed the girl how to form letters in the sand, how to decipher words in the main house's cookbooks, how to keep secret records of her discoveries about plants. The old healer always stressed that knowledge was the only inheritance no one could take. If Celia could read, she could learn anything. If she could write, she could leave her mark on the world, even when others believed her invisible. When Mama Ruth died of fever in 1845, Celia naturally assumed her place as head cook. She was 24 years old then, had married a blacksmith named Samuel, and borne 3 children. Thomas, born in 1841, Mary, born in 1842, and little David, born in 1844. The family lived in a cabin slightly larger than the others, a privilege granted due to Celia's importance to the house's standing. Colonel Riverside rarely spoke to Celia directly, conveying his demands through his wife Rosalind, a pale, nervous woman who spent most of her time embroidering and taking laudanum for her nerves. It was Rosalind who planned the menus for special events, always consulting a recipe book that had belonged to her mother-in-law. But it was Celia who transformed those instructions into edible works of art. The main house kitchen was Celia's domain, spacious with a large iron stove boasting multiple ovens, shelves lined with spices from distant places via river trade, and a pantry that rivaled those of city hotels. She commanded a team of 6 assistants, all young women she had trained herself. Each had her specialty. Sarah handled breads and pastries. Hannah prepared the meats. Lily was in charge of preserves and pickles. But Celia kept the most crucial secrets to herself. She was the one who prepared the special sauces that made guests sigh with pleasure. She who knew precisely how long to smoke the ham to achieve the perfect texture. She who knew the exact blend of herbs that turned a simple chicken broth into something unforgettable. Celia's children lived in the slave quarters with the others, but would sometimes come to the kitchen when she needed to watch them while she worked. Thomas, 7 years old in 1848, already showed an interest in learning his father's trade at the forge and would often accompany him when her kitchen duties allowed. Mary, 6 years old, had inherited her mother's curiosity for plants and would sometimes go with her when Celia gathered herbs near the quarters. David, still small at 4 years old, was content to play with cornhusk dolls that Celia made for him in her rare free moments. Life on the plantation followed a predictable rhythm, and within the confines imposed by slavery was relatively stable. Celia had found a way to shield her family through her indispensable usefulness. The colonel would never sell the cook who guaranteed his social reputation, and by extension, would never break up her family. It was an illusion of safety she carefully nurtured, not realizing that stability in a slave's life was always a mirage, forever dependent on the whims and tempers of those who held absolute power over their existence. Addison Riverside, the colonel's eldest son, had lately returned from his studies in Natchez. At 22, he was a younger, cruder version of his father, with the same cold stare, but without the discipline that comes with age and responsibility. He had cultivated during his college years a taste for amusements that involved exerting power over those who could not fight back. Celia had noticed how Addison looked at her younger assistants, how he found excuses to visit the kitchen when his father was absent. She had started keeping the girls constantly occupied when he appeared, always under her direct watch. But she could not be everywhere at once, and Addison had all the time in the world. What Celia did not know was that Addison had noticed her children during their brief visits to the kitchen, and that in his twisted mind he was beginning to see in them a chance for amusement he considered perfectly harmless. After all, they were just games. Enslaved children, well, they needed to learn their place in the world early. During the hot summer afternoons, when fieldwork eased slightly, Addison often wandered the property looking for ways to divert himself. He had developed a particular interest in educating slave children about hierarchy and obedience. Inventing cruel games he considered valuable lessons. Celia sensed the growing tension in the quarters when Addison appeared. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men lowered their gaze and worked with renewed intensity. But she could not imagine that her own children would soon become the focus of the young master's twisted attention. The Riverside Plantation operated like a small kingdom, with its own unwritten rules and complex hierarchies. At the top stood the colonel, followed by his family, then the white overseers, and finally the slaves in their own internal divisions. Celia had learned to navigate this system carefully, using her privileged position as cook to protect her family as much as possible. But protection, she was about to learn, was an illusion that could be shattered in a single moment of casual cruelty. The autumn of 1848 came to Mississippi with a deceptive beauty, painting the oak leaves in gold and filling the air with the sweet smell of sugarcane being harvested. It was the time of year Celia most appreciated, when kitchen work intensified with the making of winter preserves and dinners grew more elaborate, celebrating the season's bounty. That October morning, Celia woke before dawn, as always. The air was crisp, nearly cold, and a thin mist lay over the fields like a ghostly shroud. She lit the fire in the kitchen and began preparing breakfast for the main house, her movements automatic after so many years of routine. Samuel had already left for the forge, and the children still slept soundly on their small straw pallets in the quarters. The day promised to be a special one. The colonel had announced he would host a group of neighboring planters, interested in discussing farming techniques and potential business partnerships. It was the sort of occasion that demanded Celia's very best, a midday meal that would impress men, accustomed to fine dining, and convince them that Riverside was a prosperous and well-run estate. Celia had planned the menu with meticulous care. Turtle soup with sherry, roasted duck with a wild berry sauce, ham glazed with honey and mustard, side dishes of candied sweet potatoes, and green beans with almonds. For dessert, her famous bourbon pudding with vanilla cream, a recipe she had perfected over the years that never failed to draw compliments from guests. While overseeing her assistant's work, Celia allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had turned the Riverside Plantation kitchen into something that rivaled the best establishments in Natchez or Vicksburg. Her labor not only upheld the colonel's social standing, but also provided relative safety for her family. It was a delicate balance, but one she had learned to maintain with skill. Around 10 in the morning, Thomas, Mary, and David appeared in the kitchen, as they did when Celia needed to mind them during work. Thomas had fed the chickens in the quarters. Mary had helped the older women collect eggs, and David, still too young for real work, had simply tried to assist his older siblings. Celia gave them pieces of sweet bread left from the main house's breakfast and told them to stay near the kitchen where she could see them. Celia laid down the rules as she always did. The children must remain in sight. Thomas must look after his younger brother and sister, and David must not wander off. Thomas, serious as a miniature adult, nodded with understanding and took responsibility for his siblings. Celia watched them play in the small yard behind the kitchen, their laughter carrying on the morning air. For a moment, she let herself imagine a different future for them. Perhaps Thomas could learn to read and write as she had. Perhaps Mary could use her knowledge of plants for something more than survival. Perhaps David could grow up in a world where having dark skin did not automatically mean being someone's property. They were dangerous dreams, she knew. Dreams that could break a mother's heart, but they were all she had to give her children besides love and protection. The morning passed swiftly in lunch preparations. The guests arrived at noon, well-dressed men coming on horseback and in plain wagons, talking in loud voices about cotton, prices, and planting methods. Celia could hear them from the dining room's far side as she served the dishes, their voices confident and self-satisfied. The lunch was an absolute triumph. She could tell by the way the guests savored each dish, by the compliments that reached the kitchen through the servants' waiting table. The colonel was clearly pleased, and Rosalind even sent a message of congratulations through Sarah. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when Celia realized she had not seen the children for some time. Normally they came to the kitchen around noon, asking for something to eat or simply to be near their mother. Their absence made her slightly uneasy, but she reassured herself, thinking they were likely playing in the quarters and had lost track of the hour. It was Hannah who brought the first alarming news. She had gone to fetch firewood from the pile near the quarters, and had seen smoke coming from the old barn, the one no longer used for storing hay, which stood at the edge between the cotton fields and the slave area. Hannah came running to the kitchen, breathless, reporting heavy smoke rising from the old barn. Celia's heart stopped for a moment. The old barn was close to the quarters where the children sometimes played when not under her direct watch. Without a second thought, she dropped the spoon she was using to stir a sauce and ran for the door. She shouted over her shoulder for Sarah to watch the kitchen, already racing across the fields. The smoke was visible in the distance, a thick black pillar climbing into the blue afternoon sky. Celia ran as she had never run in her life, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Other slaves had noticed the smoke and were running the same way, carrying buckets of water from the nearby wells. When she reached the barn, the structure was already fully engulfed in flames. The heat was intense, nearly unbearable, and the black smoke made it difficult to breathe. But it was the sound that terrified her. Muffled screams coming from inside the burning building, voices she recognized instantly. Celia screamed that her children were inside, trying to rush the entrance. Strong hands held her back, stopping her from running into the inferno. It was Samuel, who had come running from the forge when he saw the smoke. Samuel shouted that she would die, struggling to hold her as she fought desperately. Other men tried to approach the entrance, but the flames were too fierce. The old, dry, wooden structure burned like paper, and the roof was already starting to collapse. The screams from inside grew weaker, then stopped entirely. Celia ceased struggling and fell to her knees in the dirt. A sound came from her throat that was not quite a scream and not quite a moan, but something more primitive, deeper. It was the sound of a soul breaking in two. It took almost 2 hours to fully put out the fire. When they could finally enter the smoking ruins, they found the 3 small bodies huddled in a corner where they had tried to hide from the flames. Thomas had attempted to shield his younger siblings with his own body, but it had not been enough. What was discovered later was that the barn door had been locked from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the children inside before setting the structure ablaze. But who and why? Addison Riverside appeared at the fire scene about an hour later, claiming he had been riding in the distant fields and only saw the smoke upon returning to the house. He offered his condolences to the colonel for the loss of valuable property and suggested it had probably been an accident. Children playing with matches, perhaps. But Lily, one of the younger kitchen helpers, had seen Addison near the barn that morning. She had gone to gather wild herbs near the quarters and seen him talking with the children, laughing at something Thomas had said. When she told this to Celia 3 days after the funeral, her words were like a second death. Lily revealed that Addison had been playing with the children, mentioning he knew a new game they would like. He had told the children to go inside the barn, promising to fetch a surprise for them. Celia said nothing. She just nodded and went on peeling potatoes for dinner. But something within her had shifted in that moment. Something had died along with her children, and something new had been born in its place. That night, alone in her empty cabin, Celia made a decision. She would no longer be just Celia, the Riverside Plantation cook. From that moment on, she would be Celia Washington. She had chosen the surname of the first president, the man who had fought for his nation's freedom, and she too would fight for her own freedom, not the freedom to run. That would be too simple, too quick. She wanted the freedom that comes with justice, the freedom that would only arrive when those who had taken everything from her paid the full price. Celia Washington began to plan. In the days that followed the funeral, she maintained her normal routine in the kitchen, but at night, when everyone slept, she would slip silently from her cabin and walk to the place where her children had died. There, kneeling among the still smoldering ruins, she made promises no human ear heard. She whispered to the scorched earth about Thomas, Mary and David, vowing she would not forget, and would make them all pay. And on moonless nights when the dark was deepest, she began collecting the plants Mama Ruth had taught her to recognize. Plants that grew only in places where death had touched the earth. Plants that carried in their roots and leaves nature's darkest secrets. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the unfolding of this story that forever changed a plantation in Mississippi. The months following the children's deaths transformed Celia in ways no one at the Riverside Plantation could fully grasp. On the outside, she remained the same efficient cook as always, perhaps even more meticulous, more devoted to detail, but those who knew her well noticed subtle changes that left them unsettled. Samuel was the first to see it. His wife had grown quiet in a different way. It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, more deliberate. She spent hours awake at night, sitting by their cabin window, looking toward the main house with an expression he could not decipher. When he tried to speak of the future, of perhaps trying for more children, she answered as if he were speaking a foreign tongue. Celia had made it clear there was no future in her mind, only the present, and the present was all that mattered. In the kitchen, Celia had begun making subtle alterations. She insisted on personally preparing every dish that went to the Riverside family table, not permitting any of her helpers to touch the food after she had added the final seasonings. She said it was to maintain quality, but Hannah noticed she had started keeping certain herbs and spices in a locked cabinet, to which only she had the key. When asked about these unfamiliar herbs, Celia simply said they were special ingredients reserved for special occasions. What Hannah did not know was that Celia had begun making nighttime trips to the swamps surrounding the plantation. Using the knowledge Mama Ruth had passed down, she gathered plants that grew only in specific soils under specific conditions. Mushrooms that sprouted on rotting logs, vines that coiled around dead trees, roots that could only be harvested in the autumn and early winter. Mama Ruth had taught her of these plants when she was young, but always with stern warnings. She had said some were for healing pains. White doctors did not know how to cure, showing some dried leaves, and others were for when healing was no longer possible, when only justice remained. Celia now understood perfectly what the old healer had meant. During the winter of 1848, she experimented. Small doses, almost undetectable, added to Addison Riverside's food. Nothing that would kill him. Not yet. Just enough to cause discomfort, to make him question his own health. Unexplained stomach pains, nausea that came and went without reason, nights of sleeplessness followed by days of extreme weariness. Addison began complaining about his health with growing frequency. He consulted doctors in Vicksburg and even in Natchez, but none could find a cause for his symptoms. Some suggested it might be stress, others recommended changes to his diet. One particularly observant doctor proposed he should perhaps avoid heavily spiced foods for a time. Celia almost smiled when she heard this recommendation discussed in the dining room. If only they knew the problem was not the spices she used, but the special ingredients she had begun to add. Meanwhile, she observed. She studied the household's patterns, meal times, each family member's food preferences. She learned the Colonel had a fondness for rich, dark sauces, that Rosalind preferred delicate, slightly sweet dishes, that Addison enjoyed rare meats and strong seasonings. More importantly, she learned the Riverside family was planning something significant for early 1849. Pearl, the Colonel's youngest daughter, had become engaged to Sylvester Thompson, son of a prominent cotton-planting family from the next county. The wedding was set for late January and would be the most important social event in the region for months. Rosalind had started preparations months in advance, consulting Celia almost daily about the menu for the wedding banquet. It would be an intimate affair, just for close family and a few dear relatives. The Riverside culinary reputation would be tested before people who truly mattered to the family. During one of these consultations, Rosalind stressed that the wedding must be absolutely perfect. A very special family occasion where everyone would remember Riverside hospitality. Celia assured her it would be perfect, a promise she fully intended to keep, and she meant it. It would be perfect, perfectly planned, perfectly executed, perfectly final. During the long winter nights, Celia began crafting her plan. It would not be a simple matter of poisoning the food. That would be too crude, too obvious. She wanted something more subtle, more artistic. She wanted each person at the banquet to receive exactly what they deserved, in the precise measure of their sins. She began researching who would be present at the wedding. Through conversations overheard in the main house, letters she saw being written, preparations she observed, she built a mental map of who would be there that night. The entire Riverside family, the Colonel, Rosalind, Addison, Pearl, and her younger brother Charles. The Thompson family, Sylvester's parents, his 2 brothers and 1 sister, a few close aunts, uncles and cousins from both families, 17 people in all. 17 lives that had profited, directly or indirectly, from the system that had murdered her children. 17 people who had never questioned the right to own other human beings, to break up families, to treat children as property. Every name she discovered was added to her mental list. And for every name, she began to plan a specific fate. Colonel Riverside, who had let his son kill 3 innocent children and then covered up the crime, would receive the main course, literally and figuratively. Addison, the direct murderer, would have a slower, more painful death. Rosalind, who had lived her whole life benefiting from the suffering of others without ever questioning it, would die bewildered and terrified, not understanding what was happening. And the others? The others would receive a lesson about the true cost of their prosperity. Celia spent the rest of the winter perfecting her recipes, not just the culinary ones, but the others, the ones Mama Ruth had taught her in secret, the ones she had learned on her own through careful experimentation. She tested dosages, studied effects, calculated timings. A particularly important discovery was that she could prepare special dishes for the few children who would be present, the Thompson youngsters. They would receive completely different food, sweet, porridges and warm milk that would make them sleep soundly through the banquet. Celia had no interest in harming innocents. Her justice was precise, aimed only at those who carried guilt. During her nighttime trips to the swamps, she also gathered plants with mild sedative properties. The children would sleep peacefully while the adults paid for their families' sins. When spring came to Mississippi in 1849, Celia Washington was ready. She had transformed from a grieving cook into something far more dangerous. A woman with a plan, with knowledge, and most of all, with nothing left to lose. Pearl Riverside's wedding would be remembered for generations, but not for the reasons the family expected. In her final weeks of preparation, Celia began leaving small signs of her transformation. She wrote in her secret notebook, the same one where Mama Ruth had taught her her first letters, not just recipes, but thoughts on justice, on the price of silence, on what happens when patience finally expires. She wrote one night by candlelight that they thought they were invisible, that they did not see, did not remember, did not feel, but she was the living memory of all their sins. And memory, when it finally speaks, has a voice that echoes through the centuries. Samuel noticed she had started using the surname Washington when she signed her notes. When he asked about it, she explained she had chosen her own name, declaring she was now free to choose her own destiny as well. He did not entirely understand what she meant, but something in her tone made him decide not to ask further. The morning of January 27, 1849, dawned clear and cold in Mississippi, a thin layer of frost covering the cotton fields like powdered sugar on a cake. It was Pearl Riverside's wedding day, and the plantation had been a whirl of activity since before sunrise. Celia had awoken at 3 in the morning, as she had planned for months. Not from nerves or anxiety, but because she had much work ahead, the kind of work that demanded absolute precision, perfect timing, and above all, a calm she had cultivated during the long months of preparation. The main house kitchen had been turned into the headquarters of a military campaign. 3 ovens operated at once. Huge pots simmered over the fire, and her 5 assistants moved in a rehearsed choreography, each responsible for specific parts of the banquet. But Celia kept absolute control over the most critical elements, the seasonings, the sauces, and especially the final touches on every dish. The menu had been planned with the meticulousness of a general preparing for battle. Appetizers of fresh oysters from New Orleans via river trade, served with a mignonette sauce she had prepared herself. Turtle soup with sherry, a specialty she had perfected over the years. The main course would be a whole roasted pig, glazed with honey and mustard, accompanied by smoked ham, roasted duck with a cherry sauce, and a variety of side dishes that would make the guests remember this banquet for the rest of their lives. Which, as Celia knew, would not be very long. The guests started arriving around noon. Wagons and horses came up the circular drive to the main house, bringing the Riverside's closest kin. Celia watched them discreetly through the kitchen window. identifying faces she had studied for months through descriptions and overheard talk. There was the Thompson family patriarch, Colonel Wilfred Thompson, known for his brutal disciplinary methods on his own plantations. Beside him, his wife Matilda, who was famous for separating slave families as a tactic to prevent strong bonds. The two older Thompson sons, Seth and Randolph, both following in their father's cruel footsteps. The younger daughter, Jeanette, who despite her youth already showed the same contempt for slaves that marked her family. 17 guests in total, each carrying their own guilt, their own sins against humanity, and Celia had prepared something special for each of them. The wedding ceremony was held in the main house garden under a pavilion decorated with white flowers and silk ribbons. Pearl was radiant in her lace dress imported from Charleston, and Sylvester Thompson looked suitably nervous beside the makeshift altar. Reverend Matthews, a portly man who served several plantations in the area, conducted the service with his usual sonorous voice. Celia watched it all from the kitchen window while overseeing the final preparations. There was something almost surreal about seeing all that celebration of joy and love, knowing what was to come. But she felt no remorse, only a cold, calculated satisfaction. When the ceremony ended and the guests moved to the dining room, Celia gave an almost imperceptible signal to her helpers. It was time to serve. The hall had been decorated with the best the Riverside house could offer. Crystal reflected the light of dozens of candles. The family silver shone on the white linen tablecloth, and elaborate flower arrangements scented the air. The guests took their places at an oval table that dominated the room, with the newlyweds at the center and the most important families in seats of honor. Before the main banquet, Celia had prepared something special for the 3 children present. 2 young Thompson children and a Riverside niece. She personally served them sweet porridges seasoned with honey and mild spices, plus warm milk with vanilla. The children enjoyed the treats and within minutes began to yawn. Their mothers, thinking it was just natural tiredness from the day's excitement, took them upstairs to rest in one of the bedrooms. Celia had calculated perfectly. The children would sleep deeply for hours, safe from what was to come. The first course was served without incident. The oysters were met with general approval, and Celia noted with satisfaction that even the most particular guests seemed impressed. She had used only a very light touch of her special ingredients in this dish, just enough to start the process, to prepare the guests' digestive systems for what was coming. The turtle soup was an even greater success. Colonel Riverside stood to make a toast, publicly praising his cook's skill and prompting a round of applause from the guests. Celia, watching discreetly through the kitchen's partly open door, permitted herself a small, cold smile. It was during the main course that things began to get interesting. Celia had spent weeks calculating dosages through trial and error for each person. Colonel Wilfred Thompson, for example, received a generous portion of the roasted pork, seasoned with a special blend of herbs she had gathered during the autumn and early winter. The effect would be gradual, but relentless. First, a feeling of heat, then mounting nausea followed by convulsions, and finally respiratory failure. For Matilda Thompson, who had made a habit of separating slave families, Celia had prepared something more poetic. Her dish contained a carefully measured dose of a toxin that would cause terrible hallucinations before death. She would see her own victims returning to torment her, feel the despair of the families she had torn apart. The Thompson sons received dishes laced with substances that would attack their nervous systems, causing a gradual loss of motor control, followed by paralysis. They would feel their bodies slowly failing them, just as they had failed to protect those under their power. And Addison received special treatment. Celia had saved for him a combination of 3 different toxins, each taking effect at a different time. First would come intense abdominal pain, then loss of muscle coordination, and finally a paralysis that would leave him conscious but unable to move as his body slowly shut down. The banquet proceeded for nearly 2 hours, with the guests savoring each dish and lavishly praising the food's quality. There were toasts to the newlyweds, speeches about family prosperity, lively conversations about politics and business. The mood was one of genuine celebration and contentment. It was around 9 in the evening that the first symptoms began to appear. Colonel Thompson was the first to complain of a sudden illness. He had just finished a speech about the importance of maintaining discipline on plantations when he suddenly went pale and put a hand to his stomach. His wife, seated beside him, asked if he was all right. But before he could answer, she herself began to feel a burning in her throat. Within minutes, the elegant hall turned into a scene of chaos. Guests began rising abruptly from their chairs, some running outside for fresh air, others doubling over in pain on the table. The sound of lively conversation was replaced by moans of agony and cries of panic. Addison Riverside tried to stand to help the guests, but his legs would not obey. He looked down, confused, trying to understand why his body would not respond to his commands. It was then that his eyes met Celia's, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway to observe the results of her work. For a moment they looked at each other across the chaotic hall, and in that moment, Addison understood. His eyes widened with terror as comprehension dawned, but it was already too late. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. Celia watched him for a few seconds more, then turned calmly and went back to the kitchen. She had work to do. Dishes to wash, evidence to destroy, an escape to execute. But first she had one final task. From her apron pocket, she took a small piece of paper on which she had written a message in her best handwriting. She placed the paper on the kitchen table in clear view and left by the back door. The message said simply, "For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington." When the first neighbors and the local doctor reached the Riverside Plantation the next morning, they found 17 bodies scattered through the dining hall, some still seated in their chairs, others collapsed on the floor in grotesque positions. There were no adult survivors. The 3 children were found sleeping soundly in the upstairs room, completely unharmed and with no memory of what had happened during the night. And Celia Washington had vanished into the darkness, taking with her only the clothes on her back and the satisfaction of justice finally served. The discovery of the carnage at the Riverside Plantation sent shockwaves throughout the entire South. 17 of Mississippi's most prominent citizens dead in a single night during what should have been a celebration of union and prosperity. Newspapers in Jackson, Natchez, and even distant cities like Charleston and Richmond devoted full pages to what quickly became known as the Riverside Wedding Massacre. Authorities arrived at the plantation on the morning of January 28th, alerted by Samuel, who had found the main house door open and an unnatural silence coming from within. The Warren County Sheriff, a man named Patrick Lambert, would later describe the scene as something from Dante's worst nightmares. The bodies were scattered through the elegant dining room in positions suggesting extreme agony. Some had tried to flee, being found near doors and windows. Others had collapsed onto the table, their faces twisted in expressions of unbearable pain. Most disturbing was that many still had their eyes open, as if they had remained conscious until the very end. Addison Riverside was found in his chair, body rigid, but eyes still gleaming with terror. The doctor who examined the bodies later remarked he had never seen such an intense look of fear preserved in death. It was as if Addison had understood exactly what was happening and why, but had been powerless to stop it. The initial investigation focused on the possibility of mass poisoning, an obvious conclusion given the context, but pinpointing the specific agent proved more difficult. Doctors found symptoms they had never encountered before, with each victim showing different signs of suffering. It was as if each person had been poisoned individually with substances chosen specifically for them. It was when they found the message in the kitchen that the true nature of the crime began to reveal itself. For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington. Written in a careful hand, the words burned in the minds of all who read them like both a confession and a declaration of war. Colonel Riverside, who had been away on business, in Natchez during the wedding and thus escaped the tragedy, returned at once upon getting the news. When shown the message, his face visibly paled. He knew exactly who Thomas, Mary, and David were and began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. The colonel muttered to himself, questioning how a mere cook could have carried out such a scheme. But Celia had not been a mere cook for a long time. She had become something far more dangerous. A woman with knowledge, with resolve, and with a thirst for justice that had consumed all else in her life. The hunt for Celia Washington began immediately. Posters with her description were circulated throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. A reward of $500 was offered for her capture, dead or alive, a substantial sum for the time, reflecting both the fear and the fury her act had provoked. But Celia had disappeared like smoke. Some reported seeing her walking rural roads heading north. Others swore she had been spotted boarding a steamboat on the Mississippi. There were even rumors she had been aided by a network of abolitionists, though no solid proof was ever found. The truth was simpler and more complex at once. Celia had planned her escape with the same meticulous care she had applied to the poisoning. For months, she had hidden small amounts of food and supplies in strategic spots, along a route she had memorized through the swamps and forests of Mississippi. She knew she could not use main roads or navigable rivers. Those would be the first places they would look for her. Instead, she followed old hunting trails and paths known only to runaway slaves, moving mainly by night and resting by day in hideouts she had prepared in advance. Samuel was questioned extensively by the authorities, but he genuinely did not know where his wife had gone. He had seen the changes in her after the children's deaths, but had never imagined she was capable of something so elaborate and devastating. When shown the message she had left, he wept, not from sorrow, but from a complicated mix of pride, terror, and loss. Samuel admitted to Sheriff Lambert that Celia had always been stronger than anyone knew, but confessed he had never thought her capable of such an act. The consequences of the massacre spread far beyond the Riverside Plantation. Planters across the South began to look at their own domestic slaves with new suspicion. Cooks, in particular, were subjected to increased scrutiny. Many prominent families dismissed their enslaved cooks and hired free white ones, paying high wages for a sense of security that may have been illusory. Paranoia spread like a sickness. Elaborate dinners, once symbols of Southern status and hospitality, became tense affairs where hosts tasted each dish before serving guests. Some planters went so far as to hire professional tasters like ancient kings. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. For the first time, the Southern elite was forced to confront the reality that their slaves were not passive property, but human beings with memories, with emotions, and most frighteningly, with the capacity to plan and execute revenge. Celia Washington had shattered a fundamental illusion upon which the entire slave society was built. The illusion that submission was natural, that oppression could continue indefinitely without consequence. 3 months after the massacre, a merchant reported seeing a black woman working on a small farm in Tennessee, a state where fugitive slave laws were less strictly enforced. The description vaguely matched Celia's, but when authorities investigated, they found no trace of her. There were other sightings over the years, in Kentucky, Ohio, even Canada, but none were confirmed. The truth of Celia Washington's ultimate fate remained a mystery. Some believe she died in the swamps during her escape. Others insisted she managed to reach freedom in the North or Canada. There were even those who whispered she was still alive somewhere, living under a different name, perhaps even helping other slaves escape. What was not a mystery was the legacy she left behind. In slave quarters throughout the South, her name was spoken in hushed tones with a mixture of awe and dread. She had proven that even the most oppressed could find ways to resist, to fight back, to demand justice. For slave owners, Celia Washington became a recurring nightmare. a constant reminder that their prosperity was built on foundations far more fragile than they had ever imagined. Every meal became a matter of trust, every cook a potential source of danger. And somewhere, perhaps on a small farm in Ohio or in a modest house in Detroit, or walking the free streets of Boston, a woman who had chosen her own surname continued to live. No longer as anyone's property, no longer as a victim, but as Celia Washington, a woman who had proven that justice, even when delayed, eventually finds its way. The Riverside Plantation never fully recovered from the massacre. The colonel tried to rebuild, but the property was cursed in everyone's mind. Free workers refused employment there, and even slaves from other plantations whispered stories of ghosts haunting the cotton fields. Eventually, the property was sold for a fraction of its former worth. The main house was torn down and the fields were put to other uses, but the memory remained, passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the most oppressive of systems, resistance finds a way. The 3 children who survived that night, the 2 Thompson children and the Riverside niece, grew up with no clear memory of what had happened. Their adoptive families never told them the full truth, only that their parents had died in a tragic accident. But sometimes in their dreams, they could still hear the echo of a gentle voice humming lullabies, and they would wake with tears in their eyes, not knowing why. Samuel stayed in the area a few more years, working as a free blacksmith after the plantation was dissolved. He never remarried, but was often seen visiting the small graveyard where Thomas, Mary, and David were buried. When he died in 1867, witnesses said his last words were a message for Celia, telling her he understood and forgave her. Reverend Matthews, who had officiated the fatal wedding, never again managed to perform a ceremony without trembling. He developed a habit of fasting for 3 days before any religious event, convinced God was testing his faith through fear. He died 2 years later. Some say from pure terror, others from a guilty conscience that finally consumed him. And sometimes on cold winter nights in Mississippi, when the wind blows through the fields where cotton once grew, local people swear they can still hear the echo of a voice whispering through the darkness. For Thomas, Mary, and David. But there are also those who say they hear something more. The sound of firm footsteps walking down a dusty road. The noise of a woman who chose her own destiny and never looked back. Because Celia Washington was not just a story of revenge. She was a story of transformation, of a woman who refused to accept that her pain was insignificant, that her justice was impossible. She proved that even in the darkest moments of American history, there were always those who rose against injustice, who paid the price of resistance, who chose freedom, even when it cost them everything. The story of Celia Washington remains one of the most disturbing and complex episodes in 19th century American history. In a single night, she turned a wedding banquet into a court of justice where 17 people paid with their lives for the sins of an entire society. Her act was not merely personal vengeance. It was a declaration that even those considered property possessed agency, memory, and the capacity to demand accountability. She proved that knowledge, when combined with determination and opportunity, could be more powerful than any chain or whip. What makes Celia's story so impactful is its surgical precision. She did not kill indiscriminately, but selected each victim based on their specific crimes against humanity. Each death was personalized, each suffering calculated to mirror the suffering these people had inflicted upon others, and in her final act of compassion, she protected the innocent children, proving her justice was guided by principle, not bloodlust. Today, more than 170 years later, Celia Washington's story still echoes through time as a somber reminder that injustice, when ignored for too long, eventually finds its own form of redress. She was not just a woman who lost her children. She became the embodiment of the collective memory of all those who had suffered in silence. What is most astounding about her story is not just the scale of her revenge, but the patience with which she carried it out. For months, she transformed her pain into knowledge, her rage into strategy, her grief into resolve. Every spice she added to the dishes that fatal night carried the weight of generations of unacknowledged suffering. Celia Washington forces us to face uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the price of systematic oppression. She reminds us that behind every system of domination are real human beings with hearts that can break and minds that can plan retribution. Her choice to take the surname Washington was no accident. It was a declaration of personal independence, a claim to her own identity in a world that saw her only as property. In that simple act of renaming herself, she transformed from victim to author of her own history. Celia's final fate remains unknown, and perhaps that is for the best. Her true victory was not in escaping man's justice, but in proving that justice has many faces, and that sometimes it comes served on fine china, seasoned with herbs that grow in the dark swamps of Mississippi. The Riverside Plantation may have been destroyed, the bodies may have been buried, but the memory of Celia Washington lives on. She became more than a person. She became a symbol, a warning, a promise that even in the cruelest of systems, resistance finds a way, and perhaps somewhere on a cold night, when the wind blows through the empty fields where cotton once grew, you can still hear the echo of her voice whispering through the darkness. Justice may be served cold, but it is always served. If this story touched something within you, it is because the memory of Celia Washington still walks among us, reminding us that true freedom sometimes demands a price few are willing to pay. Share this story with someone who needs to know that even in history's darkest hours, there were always those who refused to accept injustice in silence. If you want more stories like this, revealing forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like to support this work, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe Celia Washington found true freedom in the end? Was her justice legitimate, or was it merely revenge? History does not give us easy answers, but it gives us Celia Washington, a woman who decided that some injustices are too great to be forgiven, and that some memories are too powerful to be forgotten.